All right, today we're going to look at the rest of Revelation chapter 21 in verses 9 through 27. You know, houses are built with a variety of foundations, and no matter how beautiful a particular house may look, if it isn't built on a firm foundation, there will be trouble at some point down the road. When I was growing up, I split my time between my grandparents' house in North Carolina and my parents in Maryland. And my grandparents' house was an old farmhouse that was built before the days of electricity and indoor plumbing. I thought that it was a big deal when we got an electric pump on the well, and we didn't have to go out and pump the pump anymore. And we had a party line telephone. The phone did not have a dial on it. You just picked it up and told the operator who you wanted to talk to, and she would connect you. And our ring, I'll never forget, was two longs and a short. Well, that house sat on pillars that were made out of cement blocks, and the crawl space was not insulated. So you did not walk around on the house barefoot during the winter. Now, the soil in that area is somewhat sandy, so I'm surprised that these columns didn't settle over time, but they held up pretty well. And last I heard, the house was still standing, and even though it's been vacant for about 50 years, it appears to be in fairly good condition. My parents' home in Baltimore was a post-World War II, two-bedroom, one-bath, cookie-cutter Cape Cod with a basement. And fortunately, my parents had two boys, so they didn't have to have another bedroom. Unfortunately, the foundation wasn't that great. There was a housing shortage after World War II, so these houses were built in a hurry, and they weren't always built right. The house originally had a coal furnace with one big grate in the center of the house where the heat came up directly from the furnace in the basement. Later on, it was converted to oil. I can remember on cold winter days, my mother would stand on that grate and her dress would kind of billow out like a parachute. The hot water heater was attached to the furnace, and it didn't run all the time like they do today. If you wanted to have hot water, you had to go down into the basement and light the gas burner and wait for the water to heat up. And then you have to shut it off before it overheated. Well, the builder goofed. It seems that when they poured the basement floor, they ended up with about an inch lower than it should have been. So when they installed the furnace, there was a gap between the floor grate upstairs and the furnace in the basement. Well, since there was no way to lift the furnace up, they saved about an inch off the floorboards, the floor joist on that side of the house to lower the floor in order to compensate for their mistake. So the floorboards on that side of the house were about an inch lower than the other side of the house. And there was a dip in the center, right about where the grate was. I can't tell you how many toys I lost down that would roll down that slope and into that floor grate, and I've never seen them again. Years later, after I got married and moved out, my parents replaced that old furnace with a modern one. I would have loved to have been around to look at that old furnace when they took it out to see how many toys were still down in there that may have survived over those years. The way that things were designed back then, it's a wonder that all of us didn't die from carbon monoxide poisoning. Well, the foundation of that house was never waterproofed properly, so I remember as a kid having to bail water out of the basement every time we got a hard rain. Eventually, my parents installed a sump pump, so that problem seemed to be solved, but that created a whole new problem. It seems that the sump pump was plugged into the only outlet on that side of the basement. And every now and then, someone would unplug the pump in order to plug something else into that outlet. And when they got done, they would forget to plug the pump back in, and we didn't know until the next rainstorm, and ended up bailing water out of the basement again. Eventually, the foundation was waterproofed, and they finished one half of the basement into a den. When Teresa and I got married, we rented apartments for a few years until we saved enough money for a down payment on a house. Well, the foundation of the building where our storeroom wasn't waterproofed properly, and it flooded, and we lost everything that was in it. A few years later, we bought a row home. That's the fancy word for the realtors are using today is townhouse. I think that makes the house sound like it's worth more money. Well, the foundation of that house was fine, and the basement was dry and solid. Then in 1979, Avis transferred me to the world headquarters in Garden City, New York, where I worked as director of fleet operations for all of North America. And we bought a 3-bedroom split-level house on a big piece of property. I love the house, but I grew to dislike that very big piece of property. The foundation of that house was half slab and half basement. Unfortunately, I found out the hard way that the foundation of this house had settled a little bit over time from the time it was built. It was still pretty solid, but the settling had to put a kink in the sewer line right where it exited the house, and the toilet paper just loved to get stuck in that bend of the pipe. I had a utility tub and a mirror in the basement that I used in the morning to shave and do all the other good stuff you have to do before you go to work. Well, I knew I had a problem when one morning sewage started to bubble up onto my sink wherever Teresa would run water in the upstairs bathroom. Then, after the division of Davis that I worked for was purchased by UPS, they wanted to move me to Connecticut, and I did not want to go. So I found myself without a job. Eventually, I got a job with Hill Truck Rental in Orlando, so we moved to Florida. Well, our water table in Florida is so high that nobody has a basement, so houses here are usually built on concrete slabs, and of course ours is no exception. When I lived in Maryland, our house was in the suburb of Baltimore called Dundalk. Well, we had a friend who lived in an old farmhouse nearby that was built in the 1700s. In fact, the British Army had used that house as their headquarters during the Battle of North Point in the War of 1812 when they attempted to capture Baltimore. Star-Spangled Banner, anyone? Well, part of the foundation of that house was a couple of old tree stumps. The builder simply cut down the trees and he built the house on top of the stumps. But those guys knew exactly what time of the year to cut those trees. Those trees, the stumps, basically got as hard as stone, and they are just as sturdy today as they were 300 years ago. Well, Jesus used the idea of how important a firm foundation is in a parable he told about two houses. One was built on a rock and the other one was built on sand. And the one built on the rock was the only one that was still standing after the storm was over. That analogy explains why our lives must be founded in obedience to Christ. Christ is the foundation of our Christian life. And the strength of a foundation and the soil it's built on are huge factors in how the house can stand. Crumbling brick and eroding dirt and settled fill are not the best choices for a house that is intended to last forever. Well, today's scripture passage describes the New Jerusalem, and it gives some of the features of its construction. It has massive walls, and it's built on the rock of a mountain. After all, that's what we would expect to see in a city that's designed to last throughout eternity. Cities in the ancient world were established with three primary things in mind. They had to have access to water, they had to be near a major trade route, and they had to be located in a defensible position. That's why most of the ancient cities were built on high ground. The height of the hill combined with the height of the wall gave the city's defenders a great tactical advantage if they were ever attacked. Their attackers would have to advance uphill, and that made them easy targets for archers on the wall. The extra height also allowed their arrows to travel farther than their attackers' arrows could be because their attackers were shooting up a hill. So the defenders would be able to pick off a lot of enemy soldiers before they got close enough to shoot back. Then, when the attackers finally did reach the wall, being up high allowed the defenders to throw heavy rocks and pots of boiling oil down on them, and it would roll down the hill to be more effective. Well, the city of Jerusalem has water that comes from an underground spring known as the Pool of Siloam, and that water is brought into the city through an underground tunnel that was built by King Hezekiah. So, for all intents and purposes, Jerusalem had an endless water supply. And as a matter of fact, the tunnel is still carrying water into Jerusalem today, but today it's just a tourist attraction. The city was also near several major trade routes, and as far as defense was concerned, we read this in 2 Chronicles, and Uzziah prepared for all the army shields, spears, helmets, coats of mail, bows, and stones for slinging. In Jerusalem he made machines invented by skillful men to be on the towers and corners to shoot arrows and great stones. A strong system of walls and gates not only permitted the strong defense, it also acted as a deterrent to any would-be attackers who might think of attacking that city. They would look at a city's fortifications and they'd realize that they stood to lose more than they would gain by attacking it. Walls were also defined the city's fortified boundaries, and strong gates controlled who was going to be allowed to enter the city. I'm sure that you've all heard about cities who give people a key to the city as a way to thank someone for something they've done for the people. Well, there was a time when that key really did work to unlock the city gates. Back then, if you wanted to show someone that you trusted them, you would give them a key to the city gate so that they could open and close the gate and go in and out anytime they wanted to. Cities still give away keys today, but today it's just a ceremonial. These walls could be massive. Archaeologists tell us that the walls that Nebuchadnezzar built around the city of Babylon were 300 feet high and 80 feet thick at the base. They claimed that the walls around Babylon were wide enough on the top that they would allow chariot races to be held there. Walls like that made the city virtually impregnable. And the bigger the wall was, the more prestigious the city had to be, because only rich cities could afford to build a wall like that. Well, the walls around Jerusalem may not have been quite as impressive as the walls around Babylon, but they were pretty formidable as well. In fact, the only time Jerusalem was ever overrun by an attacker was when God allowed it to happen because of their disobedience. Well, this helps us to understand why John's vision depicts the New Jerusalem as a city that has a tremendous wall and gates. For John, as well as his first century readers, the greatest city imaginable should have an imposing outward appearance. Now, the New Jerusalem that John saw in his vision was not a figment of his imagination. Even so, we should take every detail of this description as a physical characteristic. We should not take every detail about the description of that city as a physical characteristic, because the Bible does contain figurative and symbolic language. John's vision describes a city that is in the unimaginable dwelling place of God, and it's going to be made available to humanity. Human history began in a garden, but it's going to end in a city. Since the city contains the tree of life, it's something like Eden restored. Remember, Adam lost access to the tree of life when he sinned. Even so, it's not a pristine garden, it's a city. It's a place where plenty of room for the multitudes of saved people who are going to live there throughout eternity. On the night that Jesus was crucified, he made this wonderful promise to everyone who believes in him. He said, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again to take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." The Father's house that Jesus was referring to is the New Jerusalem. That's where God will live with his people throughout eternity. This is the capital of the present heaven. It's the place where God currently lives with his holy angels, and it's where believers currently go when they die. But after Christ returns, and after he rules here in the rebuilt Jerusalem for 1,000 years, the old earth will disappear, and the place that Jesus has prepared for all of true believers will descend in its eternal state to be the capital city of the new heaven and the new earth. Well, it's normal for people to want to know something about a foreign country that they're planning to visit. And believers have always wanted to have a glimpse of that glorious place where they're going to spend their eternity. So knowing how eager people are to know something about their eternal destination, God has provided believers with a description of heaven. And even though only a few details are given, the few details are rather overwhelming. Well, as the vision of the New Jerusalem unfolds, history has ended and time is no more. John and his readers are transported to the eternal state. Now, in verse 8 of this chapter in Revelation, John has just finished describing the fate of the damned in the lake of fire, and we talked about that last time we met. Then, beginning in verse 9, God transported John to the eternal dwelling place of the redeemed. And since the city is the capital of heaven, it's a link between the new heaven and the new earth, and the New Jerusalem is the center point of this vision. So John gives us a lot more detail about this city than the rest of the eternal state. We also see this city mentioned in the book of Hebrews. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him in the same promise. for he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. The next chapter, the writer of Hebrews described the New Jerusalem. But you have come to Mount Zion and the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkling blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Then, as the writer closes out his epistle, he reminds his readers, for here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come. What Abraham, as well as the writer of Hebrews, along with the rest of the redeemed humanity, have anticipated by faith, was revealed to and described by John in the book of Revelation. Well, John's view of heaven's capital includes several features: its general appearance, its exterior design, and its internal appearance. Look at verses 9 to 11. Then came one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of seven last plagues, and spoke to me, saying, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, its radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. John's vision of the heaven's capital city begins with an angel calling his attention to it. The last appearance of an angel in Revelation was thousands of years earlier at the beginning of the millennial kingdom in chapter 20. Angels play a very significant role in the book of Revelation, and it appears that this particular angel was one of the seven angels that administered part of the tribulation judgments. And more specifically, John mentions the seven bowls of God's wrath that were poured out on the earth by the angels during the tribulation. John saw a lot of angels in his vision, and sometimes it's hard to tell one from the other. And in this case, it seems to be singling out one angel from among a group of seven. Well, exactly who are these seven angels? John introduced them to us back in chapter 8. They are sometimes called the angels of the presence. These angels deliver the prayers of the saints to God, and they go in and out of God's presence as special messengers. There are some non-biblical Jewish writings that identify these seven angels as Gabriel, Michael, Raphael, Uriel, Regula, Sariel, and Remiel. Luke may have been referring to some of these seven angels of the presence when he wrote, And the angel answered him, I am Gabriel, I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. When John was introduced to these seven angels back in chapter 8, he tells us that God gave each of them a trumpet. However, in chapter 21, he skips the seven trumpets and he focuses on the seven bowls that are full of the seven last plagues that will strike the earth. He introduced these seven bowls in chapter 15 when he said, And one of the four living creatures gave to the seven angels 7 bowls full of wrath of God who lives forever and ever. The bowls themselves really aren't significant. What's significant is what these bowls contain. In chapter 15, John tells us that they're filled with the wrath of God. In this chapter, he says that they're filled with the 7 last plagues. The Greek word that John uses that's translated plagues in verse 9 is plagae. It means to strike. In common uses, it referred to a great calamity. Ever since Moses confronted Pharaoh in the book of Exodus and God sent 10 plagues on Egypt, the word plague has gone on to represent God's wrath against willful ungodliness. So the contents of those bowls represents God's first and ultimate judgment against evil. Now, John's tour of the heavenly city begins with one of the angels, 7 angels says, Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. The Bible very often portrays the church as the bride of Christ, and that's not referring to the visible church. That church has been infested with Satan's weeds. This is referring to the invisible church that is made up of true believers. To refer to the church as the bride of Christ and Jesus as the bridegroom emphasizes the close relationship that the true believers have with Christ. Verse 9 is the center point of chapter 17, center point to chapter 17, verse 1, which says, "Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters.'" This is a reference to the satanic symbol of evil that stands in opposition to God. Later on in that same chapter, that evil system is identified as Babylon, the great mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. We talked about this a few months ago when we were looking at end-time prophecy. This is the apostate church, not Christ's church. This is man-made church that has prostituted itself to the world. And that city stands in sharp contrast to the heavenly city that John sees in chapter 21. Now, there are some people who say that this verse isn't referring to Babylon at all. They feel that Babylon is symbolic of Rome because Rome was persecuting the church at the time. Well, if John meant Rome, then why didn't he say Rome? I think he's referring to Babylon because Babylon is the birthplace of almost every false religion in the world. It was the site of the Tower of Babel, and it's the birthplace of astrology, which God says is an abomination. Now, as I said last week in our lesson from chapter 21, the New Jerusalem is described as a bride because it takes on the characteristics of the people occupied. The bride was a title that was given to the church back in chapter 19. But here, the title has been enlarged to include more than just the church. It includes all redeemed people. In this case, it also includes all the people who came to Christ after the church had been taken up into heaven at the rapture. Now, to call all the redeemed people of all ages the bride of Christ is appropriate because they are forever joined to Christ. Also notice in verse 9 refers to the church as the wife of the Lamb. You see, at this point, they're already married. The wedding feast took place 1,000 years earlier. It happened in chapter 19, right after the church was taken into heaven at the rapture. Now, when John had his vision of the future and wrote the book of Revelation, it was very late in the 1st century A.D. John was probably in his 80s. In fact, he was the last living apostle, and he was being held prisoner by the Romans on the island of Patmos. But he was miraculously transported from there to an amazing spiritual journey to see what no unaided human eye could ever see on its own. John's vision was not a dream. They were realities that were similar to the experience that Paul talked about in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 when he was taken up to the 3rd heaven. Well, John's tour begins when the angel transports him to the top of a great mountain. And from that vantage point, the angel showed John the entire city, holy city, Jerusalem. Then John repeats his observation from verse 2 that the holy city came down out of heaven. This is to emphasize the fact that, like the writer of Hebrews said, this was the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. In other words, the New Jerusalem was not built by men. Now, don't misunderstand this. What John is describing here is not a creation of heaven either. It's simply the descent of what was already existed in heaven from eternity past, and is now situated in the center of the new heaven and the new earth. All right, look at verse 11, having the glory of God. The most distinguishing characteristic of this city is that it contains the throne of God. And because of that, it also contains God's glory. And God's glory will reach its fullest expression in that city. It will be unlimited, unconfined, and it will be flashing out of the city throughout the entire recreated universe. Jesus prayed this prayer: Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, and see my glory that you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world. The glory of God is the sum total of his attributes, and it manifests itself in a blazing light in the Old Testament and in the person of his Son in the New Testament. Unfortunately, when God revealed his glory, disobedient people rejected him. Even Jesus Christ, who was the embodiment of God's glory, was rejected by the very men that he had come to earth to save. By radiating from the New Jerusalem, will be the brilliance of the full manifestation of God's glory. And John goes on in verse 11 to describe the effect that God's glory that was radiating from the New Jerusalem is radiance like a most rare jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. The word radiance in that verse translates the Greek word phoster. It refers to something that radiates light. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's called that because Septuagint is a Latin word for 70. And the Septuagint was translated from the original Hebrew and into Koinos Greek by 70 Jewish scholars. Now, as the story goes, 300 years before Christ was born, the Greek king of Egypt, Ptolemy II, brought in 72 Jewish elders and put each of them in their own chamber separated from the others. And he didn't tell them beforehand what he wanted them to do. Well, once they were settled in their chambers, he entered each room and said, "Write for me the Torah of Moses, your teacher." Well, when they were finished translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, the scrolls were compared. And to Ptolemy's amazement, they were all absolutely identical. God had inspired each of these men to translate each word exactly as the others did. Well, they used the Greek word mohor as in the book of Genesis to refer to objects that radiate the light from heaven. In the New Testament, it's the Greek word phoster. So to John, the heavenly city resembles a giant light bulb that was radiating God's glory to everything around it. But that light didn't radiate through the thin glass of a light bulb. Instead, it radiated through what looked like a most rare jewel, like a jasper clear as crystal. So the entire city had the appearance of a giant precious stone, a jasper. Now, John was not referring to the stone that we call jasper today. In fact, it isn't referring to a jasper at all. Notice that John says it's like a jasper. What we call a jasper today is opaque, but John says that this stone was clear as crystal. The word that John used here is a transliteration of the Greek word iaspis, which refers to the translucent stone. The Hebrew word is yusophe, which literally means to polish, but both words are usually translated as jasper. Now, jasper comes in a variety of shades of red, yellow, brown, and green, but its reference is most often in the Bible as being green. So, in this case, John tells us that God's radiance appears to him as though it was passing through something like a most rare jewel, since it was flawless and clear as crystal. And personally, I think that the reference to jasper is simply telling us that God's glory appears to be the same color as a jasper stone, probably a dark green color, and it was translucent like a ruby would be. So God's radiance filled heaven's capital city as though it were passing through a huge, flawless gemstone that is refracting in the brilliant, glazing glory of God through the new heaven and the new earth. Now, John describes the exterior design of heaven's capital city. Unfortunately, human language isn't adequate to fully describe the unimaginable magnificence of the eternal home of all believers. This has led many people to be unwilling to take the language of this scripture at face value. Instead, a lot of them are trying to find some kind of hidden meaning behind what John is describing here. But if the words don't really mean what they say, then who has the authority to say what they do mean? You see, abandoning the literal meaning of the words that are found in Revelation would serve no purpose. So you need to ask yourself, why would John use symbolic language when it would be much easier to just say what he means? Not doing that would only lead to a lot of useless speculation. So for me personally, unless the words are obviously symbolic, I will always try to interpret them literally. Now, there are cases where John does describe things using symbolic language, in cases where he was witnessing something that he had never seen before. He had to describe it in the best way he knew how by comparing what he was seeing to things that he had seen before. Now, the heavenly city is certainly a lot more than what we see here, but it certainly isn't anything less and something different from what John is describing here. It is a material creation, but the heavenly city is so unique that our human minds have trouble comprehending it. Even so, John gives us enough information about it for us to be excited to go there. First, he says it had a great wall. This tells us that this city has defined boundaries and specific dimensions. It isn't some shapeless mirage that's just floating out there in space someplace. It's a real place. There is also 12 gates giving access to the city in all directions. And each of these gates is guarded by one of the 12 angels that are stationed there to attend to God's glory and to serve God's people. And on the gates, the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel were inscribed. This celebrates God's special covenant relationship with Israel. These were the people of the promise, the covenants, the scriptures, and the Messiah. These gates were also arranged systematically. Look at verse 13. On the east, 3 gates. On the north, 3 gates. On the south, 3 gates. And on the west, 3 gates. This arrangement reminds us of the way the 12 tribes were camped around the tabernacle in Numbers chapter 2. As well as the allotment of the land around the millennial temple in Ezekiel chapter 48. All right, look at verse 14. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. Now, just as a footnote here, there are a lot of numbers being tossed around in verses 9 to 14, and they should be taken literally. But they also have a symbolic meaning as well. In Hebrew numerology, the number 3 represents fullness, the number 7 represents completeness, and the number 12 represents perfection. And they are not intended to be treated simply as numbers in a math equation. These numbers communicate the fact that God's will is going to be done perfectly when God makes all things new. Now, these foundations commemorate God's covenant with the church. Paul said that the church was built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. So at the top of each gate, we see the name of one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and at the bottom of each gate, we see the name of one of the apostles. So the layout of the gates of the city show us the favor that God shows to all of his people, both those under the old covenant as well as those under the new covenant. Then a curious thing happens. Look at verse 15. And the one who spoke with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. Now, God wasn't showing off by making the measuring rod out of gold. Gold doesn't shrink, expand, decay, or warp like a lot of other materials will do, so the measurement is perfect every time. This is reminiscent of the measuring of the millennial kingdom that Ezekiel spoke about, as well as the measuring of the tribulation temple that we read in chapter 11 of this book. These 3 measurements are significant because they mark out what belongs to God. Well, the result of the angel's measuring is in verse 16. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width, and he measured the city with a rod 12,000 stadia. Its length and width and height are equal. A stadia is a surveying term, and it's measured with a rod. The length of a stadia in ancient Greece was based on the length of the average sports arena of that time, which is about 600 feet. That means that the city measured 1,364 miles in every direction. And the city is also 1,364 miles high. Some commentators have suggested that the city is the shape of a pyramid, but it's best to be seen as a cube. Henry Morris had this to say about the pyramid theory. Such an interpretation is quite forced, however, the language of the passage being much more naturally understood to mean a cube with length and breadth and height all the same. The pyramidal shape, whether as in Egypt, Mexico, or the step towers of practically all ancient nations, seem always to have been associated with paganism, with the pyramid's apex being dedicated to the worship of the sun or of the host of heaven. That would be astrology. The first such structure was the Tower of Babel, and the Bible also places whether these were simply natural high hills or artificially constructed hills in the form of a pyramid or a ziggurat. The cube was a shape specified by God for the holy place in Solomon's temple, where God was to dwell between the cherubim. Both the language and the symbology thus favor the cubical rather than the pyramidal shape. Morris also points out that a cube-shaped city is well suited for the existence of glorified beings. It should also be remembered that the new bodies of the resurrected saints will be like those of angels, no longer limited by gravitational or electromagnetic forces as at present. Thus, it will be as easy for the inhabitants to travel vertically as horizontally in the New Jerusalem. Consequently, the streets of the city may well include vertical passageways as well as horizontal avenues, and the blocks could be real cubical blocks instead of square areas between streets, as is in present-day earthly cities. Now, based on certain assumptions that about the design of the city, as well as the number of the redeemed who will live there, Morris estimates that each redeemed person will have about 75 acres on each side. Of course, we have to take that with a grain of salt, but it's kind of an interesting exercise. Now, if you were to supernaturally superimpose the city over the map of the United States, it would extend from Canada in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south, and from Colorado in the west to the Atlantic Ocean in the east. And it will go in the same direction vertically. So it's obvious that God is going to give redeemed people plenty of room to live. Now, the point is, to put this in perspective, the city would be populated by about 7 billion people. And you would fit that number of people in the state, or rather the current world is populated by 7 billion people, and you could put that number of people in the state of Texas, and each person would have about 1,000 square feet to live in. So if we build a second story onto the state of Texas, it would fit 14 billion people there. That's twice the number of people who are currently living on this planet. And the heavenly Jerusalem is 1,364 miles high. That is a 720,000 story high building. You can put a lot of people in there. Next, he also measured his walls 144 cubits. The cubit was typically the distance measured from a man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger. The average was about 18 inches. But there was also what is known as a long cubit that measured 21 inches. Well, using the 18-inch cubit, that would make the wall 216 feet thick. Then, just to make sure that we understand that these dimensions are literal and not mystical, he has this footnote: by human measurement, which is also an angel's measurement. In other words, a foot is a foot, a yard is a yard, a mile is a mile, whether it's measured by a man or an angel. Look at verse 18. The wall was built of jasper, while the city was pure gold, like clear glass. This may be referring to the actual jasper stone this time, because this verse does not say that it was like a jasper, it says it was a jasper. And not only that, the entire city was made of pure gold that was so polished that it looked like glass. And you could see your reflection so clearly that it looked like it was clear as glass. This is all done so that the city can radiate God's glory. Someone once asked this question: if everything in New Jerusalem is clear, where would you go for privacy? Well, there won't be anything in heaven that you have to keep private. Next, John describes the walls. Look at verses 19 and 20. The foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with every kind of jewel. Then John goes on to list all the jewels that are in the walls of the city. Now, the names of some of those stones have changed over the centuries, and I'm not going to take the time to identify each of the stones and describe it to you, because it's really not that significant. These jewels represent all different colors, and they represent the light of God's glory in a rainbow of beautiful colors. This scene is breathtakingly beautiful. We have a spectrum of dazzling colors flashing out of the New Jerusalem throughout the recreated universe. Look at verse 21. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl. The next thing that caught John's eye was the 12 gates, and each were made of one gigantic pearl. Can you imagine the size of that oyster? They didn't have cultured pearls back then. I mean, cultured pearls are made by inserting an irritant into the shell of a mussel, not an oyster, so that it will form a pearl around it. These pearls are sometimes referred to as lab pearls or shell pearls. The irritant is a small piece of mantle material that has been removed from another mussel. It's usually a round ball that was about the size of the pearl you want, and is removed from the mussel as soon as the mussel coats it with a pearl material called nacre. Then they'll shape it and polish it and look like a real pearl. But very little of it was actually made by the mussel. Cultured pearls are usually made in fresh water. Natural pearls are usually made in salt water. Now don't misunderstand me, they are real pearls. But the irritant that caused the mussel to make the pearl is inserted by people. And cultured pearls are a round piece of mantle material that is covered with a thin layer of pearl material. Each mussel can produce about 40 pearls, while an oyster tends to only make one at a time. Well, as this has made pearls a lot less expensive. But back then, pearls were so rare that they were actually more valuable than gold or diamonds. Most mollusks can produce pearls, but there are only about 20 types of mollusk in the world that can make pearls of jewelry quality. And only 1 out of every 10,000 oysters can produce a natural pearl. And of those, only a small percentage are of the quality needed for jewelry. But here we have 12 pearls that are so large that a huge gate, nearly 1,400 miles high, can be made out of one of them. John Phillips explained it this way: how appropriate. All other precious gems are metals or stones, but a pearl is a gem formed within an oyster, the only one formed by living flesh. The humble oyster receives an irritant or a wound, and around the offending article that has penetrated and hurt it, the oyster builds a pearl. The pearl, we might say, is the answer of the oyster to what has injured it. The glory land in God is God's answer in Christ to wicked men who crucified heaven's beloved and put him to open shame. How it is like God to make the gates of the New Jerusalem of pearl. The saints, as they come and go, will be forever reminded as they pass the gates of glory that access to God's home is only because of Calvary. Think of the size of those gates. Think of the supernatural pearls from which they were made. What gigantic suffering is symbolized by those gates of pearl. Throughout the endless ages, we shall be reminded of those pearly gates, of the immensity of the sufferings of Christ. Those pearls, hung eternally at access routes to glory, will remind us forever of one who hung upon the tree and whose answer to those who injured him was to invite them to share in his home. All right, look back at verse 21 for a second. If seeing the outside of the heavenly city wasn't privilege enough, John's angelic guide takes him inside the city to see the internal characteristics. And the streets of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. One part of the description of this heavenly city that was always struck me as being significant is the fact that there's so much gold and precious stones used in its construction. You see, to us, these things that we seem to be the things that we feel are most valuable. But they have so little value in heaven that the precious stones are used as gravel in the mortar, and the gold and silver is used to make the walls and the paving material for the streets. I mean, after all, what would you do with gold and precious stones in heaven? God is there. What could you possibly have more valuable than that? Now, like I said last time we met, there is one structure that is very conspicuous by its absence. In verse 22, John says, "And I saw no temple in the city." Of course, the reason that there is no temple in the New Jerusalem is the same reason that the gold and precious stones are of so little value there. You don't need them. Why? John tells us, "For its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb." You will no longer need to go to a particular place to worship God, because His blazing glory is going to fill every square inch of the New Jerusalem and the new earth. You see, in heaven, there's no reason to have a temple. Life itself will be worshipped, and worship will be life itself. Believers will be the true worshipers that God has always wanted. They'll worship Him in spirit and truth. I also want you to notice something else that's very important in these verses. God the Father and the Lamb share authority equally. So don't let anyone tell you that Jesus is not God. In verse 23, John returns to the theme of God's brilliant shining glory. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and His lamp is the Lamb. Notice the equality of the God and the Lamb in that verse. The current Earth relies totally on the sun to provide the heat and the light we need. Then it relies on the moon to light the night and to generate the tides that are so important for our weather. But none of that will be needed in the new heaven and the new earth. The weather will always be perfect, so there won't be any need for tides. And the Lord's glory will supply all the light that we'll ever need. Isaiah foresaw this same reality. He wrote, "The sun shall be no more your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give you light. But the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory." J.A. Seiss commented on the brilliant light that was coming from the New Jerusalem. That shining is not from any material combustion, not from any consumption of fuel that needs to be replaced as one supply runs out. For it is the uncreated light of Him who is light, dispensed by and through the Lamb of an everlasting lamp to the home and hearts and understanding of the glorified saints. When Paul and Silas lay wounded and bound in the inner dungeon of the prison of Philippi, they still had sacred light which enabled them to beguile the night watches with happy songs. When Paul was on his way to Damascus, the light brighter than the sun at noon shone around about him, irradiating his whole being with the new sights and understanding, and making his soul and body even afterwards light in the Lord. When Moses came down from the Mount of Communion with God, his face was so luminous that his brethren could not endure to look upon it. He was in such close fellowship with the light that he became informed with light, and came to the camp as a very lamp of God, glowing with the glory of God. On the Mount of Transfiguration, that same light streamed forth from all the body and raiment of the blessed Jesus, and with reference to the very time when this city comes into being and place, Isaiah says, "The moon shall be ashamed, and the sun confounded." Ashamed because of the outbeaming glory, which then shall appear in the New Jerusalem, leaving no more need for them to shine in it, since the glory of God lights it, and the Lamb is the light thereof. On verse 24, "By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it." Now, this verse does not mean that there is going to be political kingdoms in the new heaven and the new earth. It also does not mean that national identities are going to be maintained in the eternal cities. The word translated nations is the Greek word ethnos. It's talking about different groups of people. It simply means that God is going to be universally worshipped by all the various peoples of the world. And all the kings of the earth are going to surrender their current splendor to the glory of God. I mean, after all, they won't be needed anymore. And believers are going to come to God's kingdom from every tribe and tongue and nation. Both Jews and Gentiles are going to be united in the kingdom of God as God's people. That phrase really says that there is no social status or class structure in heaven. There will be absolute equality there. And everyone who enters God's kingdom is going to surrender any glory they may have had here on earth. At this point, John tells us that they will always be safe in the new heaven and the new earth, and his gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. In John's day, cities were usually surrounded by walls, and since invaders usually attacked at night, the gates of the city were always closed and locked as soon as the sun went down. This was where the custom of giving someone the key to the city came from. It was a way of saying, we trust you enough to give you the key to the city gate so you can come and go as you please. Of course, everyone else had to make sure that they were inside the walls before the sun went down, or they'd be sleeping outside that night. But in heaven, the gates will never need to be closed at night because there won't be any night. You'll never have to worry about locking your doors again. You'll never need to feel that someone might be hiding in the shadows wanting to harm you, because there will not be any shadows to hide in. It will always be daytime in heaven. We will never again fear the darkness. I've told you this before, but I grew up in a time when my grandparents did not even own a key to their house. It was not unusual for us to come home and find someone sitting in our living room waiting for us to get there. See, it was safe. You couldn't do that today. Then verse 26 restates the fact that we'll all be equals in God's kingdom. They will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations. Kings are not only the ones who will surrender their glory to God, and all national loyalty will be dissolved into the eternal worship of God. Then in verse 27, we see that God is going to vindicate the faith of the believers by not permitting anything unclean to enter the new heaven or the new earth. But nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. The only people who will be allowed to enter the New Jerusalem will be the people who have their names written in the Lamb's book of life. You know, in John's day, rulers would keep a registry that listed the names of every person in their kingdom. And as long as they behaved themselves, they were granted all the privileges of citizenship. But whenever someone died or committed a serious crime, their names would be erased from the registry. Well, back in chapter 3, Jesus promised that he would never erase anyone's name from the book of life. The one who conquers will be clothed thus in white garments, and I will never blot his name out of the book of life, but will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Well, only those who have their names written in the Lamb's book of life will be allowed to enter his kingdom. And those names were inscribed in that book from the very beginning of time itself. Paul wrote, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him in love, he predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ according to the purpose of his will. But we ought always to give thanks to God for you, brothers, beloved of the Lord, because God chose you as the first fruits to be saved, through sanctification by the Spirit and belief in the truth. And by the power of God, who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ before the ages began. God's sovereign election is so clearly seen in those verses, I will never understand why so many people don't believe it's true. But I think it's because they desperately want to claim some of the credit for their salvation. Now, I need to mention something here. There is a passage in the book of Exodus that might seem to contradict that promise. It says, the Lord said to Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book. But there's no conflict here. You see, in verse 27, it's called the Lamb's book of life. But the passage from Exodus simply calls it my book. The Lamb's book of life records the names of the people who have placed their trust in Jesus and are saved. But the Father is the one speaking in the verse from Exodus. And that book is God's book of the living. In other words, it's God's record of the people who are alive. They are two totally different books. So the threat in the passage from Exodus is physical death, not eternal damnation. Even so, those who are loyal to the world will not have their names written in the Lamb's book of life. You see, you can't claim to love God and then live your life according to the world's standards. Jesus said, no one can serve two masters, for either you will hate one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. You can't claim to love God and then still keep the things of this world as the priorities in your life. Either God is your number one priority, or the things of the world are your number one priority. You cannot be loyal to both. And people who try to do that are not allowed to enter the eternal city to be with God. Only God's elect have their names written in the Lamb's book of life. And Paul tells us that their names were written there before the foundation of the world. Well, why is that significant? It's in chapter 20. I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Now these are the books that recorded the sins of unbelievers. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. This is the book that records the names of the people who have accepted Christ and have had their sins forgiven. And the dead, that's the unbelievers, were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. Their death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. Now, pay attention to the next verse. if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Now we're going to talk a little more about that next week. So, do you think that it's important to have your name written in the Lamb's Book of Life? You bet it is. See, your eternal security depends on it. For believers, trust is built one experience at a time. Anytime we place our trust in people or circumstances, we're going to be disappointed. But God will never fail His people. I mean, after all, He's the Alpha and the Omega. Alpha and Omega are the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. So, from our perspective, God's saying that I'm everything from A to Z. And as the beginning and the end, He certainly has the ability to keep His promises. There are three kinds of evidence that will prove that believers can trust God to do what He says He's going to do. First, there is the witness of Scripture. Second, there is the testimony of others concerning what God has done for them. And third, there is personal experience. Every time you experience His strength, His love, and His goodness, you trust Him, your trust in Him is going to grow stronger. God repeatedly told His people to remember the things that He had done for them in the past. Doing that will show them that they can trust Him in the future as well. One of the reasons that Israel failed to be faithful to so many times was that they had really bad memories. They had trouble remembering all the things that God had done for them in the past. The accounts of what happened to them should show us how important it is for us to strengthen our trust in Him. Through regular prayer and Bible study, you can firmly plant your foundation on Christ. You can also strengthen your trust in God by remembering all the things He has done for you in the past. If you pay attention, you'll probably be surprised just how involved God really is in your everyday life. All you need to do is pay attention. But we tend to write things off every time, everything that God does as coincidence or luck. But did you know the definition of coincidence and luck is that these are the times when God decides to remain anonymous? The point is this: as a part of God's church, we need to prepare ourselves to meet the bridegroom, Jesus Christ. We do that by asking the Lord to help us become all that He wants us to be. Our beauty will be evident as we grow in the grace and knowledge of God. It should be obvious to anyone around us that our names are written permanently in the Lamb's Book of Life, and because of that fact, we should want to come to Him as pure and spotless as we can. Then we need to live with the anticipation of His imminent return. We have to live with the attitude that if He doesn't come back today, He's going to return tomorrow. We are fully aware that it's only through His power that we can become the bride that He wants us to be. It's unfortunate, but it's almost impossible to tell the Christians apart from the rest of the world today. I'm sure that the description of the heavenly Jerusalem that John gives us doesn't answer all of your questions about what the future will be like for us. We have to go to the other passages in the New Testament to get more information. We also have to admit that there is going to be some questions that we're not going to have answered until we actually get there. But John's vision does give us several insights. In our future, we'll be with God. Well, someone has suggested that heaven is wherever God is, and John agrees with that. He affirms that God is going to illuminate our future home with His glorious presence. We can also see that we're also going to be alone, and we aren't going to be alone in our future home. We'll be with a great multitude of every nation in the world. The size of the New Jerusalem suggests that there will be space for a whole bunch of people. The 12 gates, with the 3 gates facing in each direction, tells us that there is adequate access to the city of heaven. So in our future, God's holy city will be heavily populated. So we definitely won't be alone. Finally, in our future home, we'll never have to face the things that have brought us harm in the past. Instead, God is going to restore us to the life that we were intended to live when we were created in God's image. Consequently, our experiences in the future home will far exceed anything that we have ever experienced here in this life. We need to remember that apocalyptic literature is hopeful literature. It was written during a time of persecution, and it was meant to encourage believers to remain faithful during those times. John's vision of the New Jerusalem is the culmination of hope and encouragement. It looks forward to the time when God is going to make everything the way it was meant to be, unmarred by sin. God has given us a glimpse what lies in our future. It's a time that God and His people are going to live for eternity in perfect fellowship. If you are a true believer, you should be encouraged by that news.